And welcome to the Leading Communities podcast, brought to you by Aspire for You CIC, Ideal Directions Marketing, and hosted by That's All Media CIC. This podcast has been put together to help community leaders learn from proven leaders from proven organisations. My name's Marianne Delaney, and I'll be your host. In today's episode, we'll be talking sports and mental health. And joining me in the studio, we have sports psychologist Jennifer Cummings and Olympian athlete Thomas Bosworth. Welcome, everyone.
Lovely to be here. Thank you.
Good. Good to meet you, Tom. How's it going?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. What I'm going to do is ask you to tell us a bit about yourselves. So, Jennifer, do you want to go first?
Yeah, happy to. So I'm a reader at the University of Birmingham, and I'm also a chartered sport and exercise psychologist. And I've been over here in the UK for the last 17 years. And if you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not originally from here. I'm Canadian, where I got my first taste of sport as first a figure skater and then coach.
Nice. That's my mind's just going through all of that information. So I'm sure more will come out as we go along. And yourself, Tom?
I'm an Olympic athlete. I've got multiple world and British records. Commonwealth Games silver medalist. I was Team GB's first track and field publicly out athlete. And yeah, that's about it. I live and train in Leeds and currently living in Brisbane, training under the sun.
Nice. Yeah, so we've got Tom joining us via phone. And he's in sunny Australia as we speak, which is nice for him. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into the first question so that we can get to grips with, helping our audiences with accessing more information from yourselves, basically. The first question we've got is, how do you get people caring about sport, and what have you learnt from trying to do so? Does anybody want to go first with that?
Sure, happy to do that. I guess as a sports psychologist, this is actually a really, really important topic for us, and it's not actually too hard to get people to care about sport, at least initially, because most often when you get involved with sport, it's at a young age, and you do sports that you really enjoy, that you try out different ones, and you start to work out which ones you maybe like better than others, and then you start to invest in that sport. But it's over time where people might start to kind of lose their enjoyment as they move up the levels, move up the ranks. As sport becomes more competitive, there's different types of stresses and pressures. And it's not uncommon for an athlete to sort of lose that kind of reason why they did their sport in the first place, that love for it, that interest, that curiosity, that intrinsic motivation, as we call it as psychologists. And so actually, what we end up doing is then working with athletes to help them maybe rediscover the love for their sport. And that's one of the reasons why an athlete might come to see a sports psychologist.
Right, okay. So is it more about, as you say, in growing up, but if it's an athlete and they're already in that, and Tom, you might have something more to say about this. So it's a good dynamics of what we've got here, two flip sides of the coin. Is it more in a professional sense, just trying to gauge in a professional sense where the mentality might dip a bit? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I mean, it really does depend on the athlete and their circumstances. But we know that there's a lot about sport that can maybe add stresses, pressures, where an athlete might be focusing on doing it for other reasons, such as, winning, achieving funding, etc. And these are all really important reasons why people do sport at very high levels, but it can sometimes take away from that sort of intrinsic love for it, the kind of natural reasons that you had when you were a kid, when you first started kicking a ball around the playground, or, maybe doing your first gymnastics class, your first swim class. And so one of the things that we do as sports psychologists is work with coaches and other sport officials to help ensure that they create an environment that really helps to balance out athletes performing at their very best and achieving their potential, but also at the same time still enjoying it, maintaining their well-being, because we know that when you start to lose the kind of love of your sport, then it's harder to commit to it. It's harder to, put in that, day-to-day practice that athletes have to do in order to stay at the top. And as a result, one of the reasons why an athlete might drop out of their sport is that they've lost that love for it.
Okay, so it's maintaining and pushing to, different levels to ensure you can maintain it and still keep that love for it, as you were saying.
That's correct. And it's normal for it to kind of dip over time and come up again, and depending on where you're at and what's going on. And I guess when it starts to become an issue is when you start to lose that love of your sport unto the point where you don't remember why you do it anymore.
Yeah.
And that's when your motivation has really shifted in a way where that might be starting to damage your well-being, for example.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So, Tom, what are your thoughts on that?
I think there's two parts to that, and with covering the athlete to start with, obviously, very few people are fortunate enough to become, successful athletes. Many may start off with those ambitions and dreams, and along the way, for one reason or another, it doesn't work out. But I think at their highest level, you need so many people and so many decisions to go your way. It can be very difficult when they don't, and it can be very difficult as an individual who is ultimately giving their all for absolutely no security in terms of income, in terms of success, of winning medals or winning games, winning matches. It's very difficult when when you're doing everything right, or you think you are, and others perhaps don't believe in you or aren't making the decisions in your favour, or whether that's lottery funding for athletes or getting picked in the first team for a football club. It's often we lose people from elite sport because getting there is almost the hardest bit. And then when you do get there, you get a lot of the support. In my case, it took me 6 years full time, working part time. I guess I wasn't full time then. Part time working, part time sport to reach the top. And I took a number of hits where I didn't receive funding, I didn't get selected for championships, and a lot of people, I imagine, can easily take that as a negative and let it beat them, and ultimately not go on to succeed. I ensured that it drove me on, and ultimately became an Olympian and achieved more than I could ever dream of. But then there's Joe Public, who I think maybe don't have the best relationship with sport at school or growing up. Not everybody is kicking a ball around. Not everybody is enjoying that, because I feel like perhaps in our country as well, we are very football, maybe a bit of rugby orientated. I didn't do any athletics in sport. I didn't know there were so many different sports out there. I think that's something that could really change sport, fitness, health, and ultimately mental health if schools and connection to society kind of opened up and created better links. So then exercise doesn't have to be about football, or perhaps going for a run on a cold evening, which most people don't want to do when they come in from work. So I think the detachment from sport can come at a very early stage.
Okay, well, that's interesting. I mean, it links quite nicely onto our next question, actually, which goes into what can communities learn from sports people or sports teams when overcoming barriers to success?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me personally, I joined an athletics club when I was 12 because my sister was at the same athletics club, but I had a motivation to keep fit, make friends, and my parents wanted me to do some exercise basically, and that's how they came about, and there happened to be links to my school as well through that athletics club, but it just happened to happen that way, and I never dreamt. I didn't even dream. I never even considered sport as an option of a career or a future, and I wasn't very good either. But I did it for enjoyment, and I think that's a huge kind of lesson for anybody, is whether it's coaches, parents, or the child or person themselves. You know, you don't have to be any good at it straight away. You don't have to, as long as you're enjoying it and that sort of thing. And I think where schools perhaps might refer a really good footballer onto perhaps an academy, or a great runner onto, or let's find the local athletics club, those links should naturally exist anyway, because ultimately it gives kids the options to try everything and anything. And I think it only benefits the clubs, because ultimately you're probably going to end up with more participants, and it's only going to benefit the students or the young people, or who knows who it'll lead to, ultimately benefiting their mental and physical health. Society is far too segregated. I think sport, you know, like that, when you're just stuck with an hour of PE or so many hours, well, barely any hours, enough hours in school, this is a perfect way to help encourage kids into sport, giving them loads of different opportunities, meeting loads of new people without it impacting on the curriculum, I guess.
Yeah. Do you know, it's, wow, I'm always having a conversation with people about how PE, I know it's physical education, but actually it should be rebranded to something like health and nutrition, because those kind of things work hand in hand, don't they? And I know that sports,
yeah, I agree,
like physical exercise wise, you know, the benefits of how that can help you mentally as well, is just phenomenal. But it's as you say, the whole hour, I don't feel is enough. But that's me. So I'm going to ask Jennifer what you think.
Sure. I mean, a lot of what Tom's saying is really, really important, because how people first experience sport as activity can actually set the stage for what they think about it, and how they then persist with it over years to come. So your first introduction, for most young people, will be in school. And there's been, I think, a real change in tide in schools in the last couple of years, with some introductions of programs like the Daily Mile and Marathon Kids, where they're taking what was formal physical education and then making it more about everyday physical activity. So with those programs, the teachers, the students, all go out and do a short period of running every day in their uniforms. They don't have to get in clothes, change into PE kits or anything like that. And the idea being they just get out and be active. And it's actually having really powerful effects on not only the young person's mental health, but also their ability to learn. So there's educational benefits too as well. So just a short bit of physical activity every day can have a massive effect. But we're also starting to see schools being more experimental in the way kids learn, so a lot more active learning. So, for example, my son's school, just yesterday, they were learning how to do division, but they were doing it through an active way, where they had, their movement, gathering bean bags, working out how to separate them. And so it takes what we think is physical activity, but then it puts it into everyday life. And that is a lot easier to become active when we do that. But kind of coming back to the question about like what can we learn from athletes, and the barriers that they overcome and how they succeed. I think there's so much we can learn from. So in our everyday life, we experience so many kind of stresses, everyday hassles that affect us, and one of the things that we learn from athletes is that they put themselves in situations every day where they're testing this, that they're practicing how to cope and respond to stressful situations. And what that tells us is that these are actually skills. These are skills that we can learn. We're not born with them. And over our childhood, our adolescence, and to adulthood, these are skills that we have to keep practicing, because like any physical skill, when we don't use them, we lose them. And so how we respond to stress, how we manage our thoughts and our feelings in response to that, are all things we can practice. And so by, for example, trying to avoid stress, we don't get those opportunities to be resilient in the face of it. And I think that's a really important lesson that athletes do teach us each and every day.
Yeah. Okay. So when it comes to communities and potentially, like community organisations working on helping people, interact with sports, so that, they might be able to have the opportunity that you've had, Tom, and become aware of everything that's going on. We've talked a lot about schools, but what can community organisations do? I'll go with Jennifer, if that's all right.
So there's lots of different ways that communities interact with sport. So for example, there's some great community organizations here in Birmingham that use sport as a vehicle for positive youth development. And what that does is help young people who might be not in education, work, or training at the moment. Maybe they face different types of disadvantages, but through sport, have the opportunity to develop their self-esteem, the belief in themselves, learn how to set goals, achieve them, teamwork with others. And a lot of these same skills are actually very transferable to the workplace. And so sport's a great way to help young people to practice these things, build confidence in them, and then be able to then use them maybe when they go out and do that job interview. And so that's a really great way that sport's being used. And we've also used it in a slightly different way. So we're currently working with an organization here in Birmingham called St. Basil's. And this is a housing service for young people who are experiencing homelessness or at risk for homelessness. And they came across some of the work that we were doing with a local Premier League football academy. And they were really interested in the mental skills training that we were doing with the players, and asked whether that same type of mental skills work could also be applicable to their young people. And of course, from based on what we said, these mental skills are really for anyone. And so we've worked with them over the last 6 years to develop a mental skills training program, taking the lessons from sport, but then sort of adapting it to their context and helping young people to kind of recognize and use their strengths to develop these mental skills in terms of how you manage your thoughts, your feelings, your behaviors, recognizing how all these things interact with each other in order to help them achieve their goals, their aspirations, and, most importantly, being able to live, more fulfilling lives where they can be independent, they can be in education, they can be in work, they can be in training. And what it comes down to is a lot of the same mental skills that athletes are also using in order to achieve their goals, whether it's an Olympic medal, being world champion, being the fastest in the world. It's the same mental skills that underpin all of this.
I think that's really interesting because listening to Jennifer there it's quite, I don't know the right word to describe it. However, I think of many of my teammates and many across all sports, people I know who are super talented and work really hard and don't achieve perhaps what they would hope and or feel that some of their successes are actually failures. And we have a saying, a lot of people in sports say, on race day, it's about 90% mentality, 10% physical effort, because ultimately you've done all the training and you've done all the hard work, but make one mistake on race day and it's all gone. All of that is irrelevant. And I think a lot of people believe that athletes, are very in control and know exactly what they're doing, when I think it's quite nice also for people to see and understand that, making mistakes, getting nervous, dealing with a situation incorrectly is something athletes do as well as kids or anybody. And translating that over and then translating that, but how to deal with that so you're taking it away with a positive, which is what successful athletes manage to do, is a huge asset to anybody. And I think it's I think that's a key difference about translating kind of what athletes do to everybody else. Is athletes don't always make the right decisions, and they certainly don't make and they certainly do make plenty of mistakes, but it's how then they manage those mistakes and those decisions which ultimately probably make them the ones making the finals, the ones winning medals, the one breaking records, rather than the ones who, the also rans and so on. And it really is that small kind of decision. Put that into everyday life, and ultimately that can come down to making a decision whether you've taken a knockback from a job interview and whether you go for the next one, or whether you bother turning out for training or to go for that run or going along to the next match because the last one didn't go well. And I think that asset can be transferred so well. I've probably gone off on a bit of a tangent then, but it was just really interesting listening there. And from where I'm sat, I see athletes are just as vulnerable as everybody else.
And that's actually really, really important for people to understand, because athletes are just as vulnerable to mental health problems as everyone else. But what is maybe different is that athletes may have more opportunities to practice their skills at being resilient. So, the examples that you just gave are absolutely bang on in terms of the types of things that we try to get across to young people in terms of, making mistakes, coming back from setbacks, and learning how to maybe reframe these as opportunities to learn from them. And we know the most successful athletes are able to draw those lessons. And it doesn't mean that they don't ever make mistakes, as you really, really well said, but actually they take them and use them in ways that then motivate them further, be able to then realize something about themselves and their personal strengths and how they can apply them to those sorts of difficult situations. And so I do really think those skills at being resilient, that there's so many examples that we can learn from sport, but it isn't just about presenting it as this kind of this thing where athletes become successful and it's kind of this simple pathway to getting there. But actually, the real lessons are from that is never one smooth pathway to the top. And in fact, there's so many bumps and turns and dips and lows and highs, and actually that's what really equips you with the mental skills to succeed.
Yeah, well, from you saying that, I always think of the conversations that I have about business and getting yourself into business, or having a new job, or going for something that you're passionate about. No one celebrates the failures because they're classed as failures, aren't they? Like there's not as you say, like a clear road to success. And actually, Tom, what you did when you spoke was actually broke down that image that I have of athletes. Actually, is that they're controlled, they know what they're doing, and I don't see the training, I don't see the hard work that goes into it. So it must be really difficult, when it's the competitive side of it. As you say, on a day, you can't. It all depends. So how do you kind of cope with the aftermath of of not winning particularly?
You have to. So I have a technique where I go into many races with outcome goals. Ultimately, ones I'd be proud of, regardless of what the outcome. The dream goal, winning gold. The other one would be, in my position, finishing a top 8 in the world or whatever. And one that I'd be a little bit disappointed with, but it's still a good day. And that way, ultimately, you take something from it, and you're able to start off on a positive foot. But it's still incredibly demoralising. It's failure all on you is ultimately how you feel, and that can be everything from failing the exam if you prepared as well as you could and did all your research and everything and studied hard. It's the same outcome, and or it's the same feelings with the outcome of failure, where really, if you can set off on a foot where there is positives regardless of the outcome, then you can analyse it far more successfully than if you have one goal, one ambition, and that's it, be all and end all. I think many athletes fail there because they set themselves up for failure, because you can't win every time. One person can win, one person, that's it. And so you have to accept what is deemed failure, but that's the wrong word. I'll give you a prime example. I went into the Olympic Games in 2016. I was ranked 27th. I was over the moon just to be at the Olympics, and I finished 6th. Some people turn around and say, well, you didn't win a medal. But for me, I set a British record, and I finished 21 places higher than my world ranking put me at. And that was a huge success. So no matter what, for me, I went in having already succeeded, even though on paper I wasn't number one. And so many people set themselves up for failure in life by just having such great ambitions, but nothing in between, nothing to get them there.
Yeah, I think we need a new word for failure that's empowering.
Yeah, definitely.
I was hesitant to actually say it when I was asking you the question, because I realised straight away, oh yeah, it's not a good word. Okay, so that kind of again leads us on to the next question, which I feel like we have discussed, but how does or can mind management make a difference? I'll go with yourself, Jen.
Sure. I think from what we've been talking about, it's hopefully pretty clear that actually it's really instrumental in terms of an athlete's success, that being able to manage not just the way that they think, but also how they feel, because these things all interact. Your emotions affect your thoughts affect how you behave. And once you start to understand how all these things are connected and how you can then manage them, is when you start to really be able to then perform effectively, particularly in stress and pressure. And these are things that you really do have to learn, that you do have to practice over time. That's not something you can just take for granted that's going to show up on race day. I often, when I work with athletes, we talk about the fact that under pressure, we tend to fall back on our habits. And so if you don't train the way that you want to compete, so i.e. in terms of your mental mindset, then it won't come under pressure as well. And so that's why we start to work early on. And it always reminds me of this. It was a study done with Olympic athletes way back in the 80s, where the Olympians talked about the fact that they probably had reached their peak physical performance about 3 to 4 years prior to making it to those games. But the thing that held them back was that they hadn't started working on the mental side of their sport. And I say back in that era, it wasn't really well known what that meant and how to do that. But over time, we've got a much better understanding of what does distinguish between the best athletes from those who don't quite make it from a psychological perspective. But we also have a much better understanding of how we can train that more effectively as well.
Yeah. Again, I can just running through the athletes of the 80s and 90s and get an understanding of that, definitely. What do you think, Tom?
To be honest, I can't put it much better myself. I said it earlier, on competition day, match day, you see it from the very best athletes in the world down to playing a basic game of football and you make a mistake. Suddenly under pressure, you can perform very, very differently. However, you've trained for these situations and the unknowns to come up, which is very hard to train for an unknown, but you try and tackle every situation in training and in mental training. Then you know what your response needs to be. If you don't prepare for that, and if you just think it's going to be smooth sailing all the way, and there's going to be no sort of hurdles, then you're going to probably fall at the first one that comes your way. So
we're talking about, obviously, again, thinking about helping communities learn from this information. I know that yourself, Jennifer, you've worked with a lot of communities, as you said, St Basil's. How can you gather evidence and learn into it, to provide information for future references? And
Sure. I mean, I think that's where working closely with organizations, communities, where together we develop these sorts of programs as well as to evaluate them, so that we do have evidence that they work, so we understand why they work, for whom they work, so that when we start to bring them to sort of different settings, different organizations, we know how to best do that. And one of the things that I've learned from working with St. Basil's is the power of evidence to help influence then those who provide funding for these types of things, governments who set policies around this. And so when they start to think about how they invest in, for example, young people, that they're investing in things that they know or work, that they can be confident that that's the case. And so although there's lots of organizations doing fantastic work in this area, they're not always able to evidence it. And so as a result, don't always have the power of that sort of information in order to make others convince them that this is an effective way to help young people to develop. So I do think there's a lot of power in being able to evaluate. And it doesn't have to be overly complicated either. And there's lots of academics like myself who are really willing to work with organizations to help make that happen too.
Okay, brilliant. Right then. Well, that's very, very informative. I've learned a lot, as I always do from these podcasts, to be honest. There's always, I go home thinking a lot about what we've been talking about. I do know that we did a behaviour, health and behaviour podcast recently, and one of the outcomes of that was saying that it takes 3 months for people to get, a habit to form. So thinking about that from, Joe Bloggs, who's walking down the street and thinks maybe I need to do a bit more, and the mentality that we've discussed and the mindset around that. It's always kind of knowing that it's not going to be something that comes overnight. It's a long road, really, isn't it? So very much about coping mechanisms and continuing to grow from that. Is that kind of right?
From my perspective, a little goes a long way. And so when we start to do a little bit each day in terms of managing our mindset, that starts to build towards, something greater down the road. But like any kind of new skill that we don't tend to start at, in terms of being fully formed, we start with baby steps and we add to it. So one great way for someone to get started with sort of working on their mental skills is maybe just to start thinking about what are the current ways that they cope. So when things are tough, when they make mistakes or they're under pressure situations, what works for them already, these are strengths that they already have. Can they start to think about how they can use them in new and different ways? And just by practicing using one of your strengths every day will have a positive impact on your mental well-being.
Tom, would you like to add anything to that? Have you got any advice or?
Yeah, I think society has set that mindset of almost that exercise is something, you've got to get into routine to do it. You've got to, it's almost got to be a chore. And I think if you find something you enjoy, regardless of what it is, whether that's everything from baking to driving, to listening to music, to exercising or doing a sport, then it will fit into a routine because you'll find a way, because you enjoy it, because ultimately you do things you enjoy. And I think for so long the option is going out for a run when it's windy and cold, going to the gym, or the five-a-side football team is only for the lads, and you go into the pub afterwards. That is not what sport is at all. And I think facilities and opportunities are getting better and getting much more. And I think what needs to be done is greater advertising and greater showcasing of the local facilities, and then encouraging what is pretty brave decision to go and try a new sport. And if you do, or try anything new, if you do, you ultimately very quickly probably find something you enjoy very, very quickly. And I think we could genuinely transform society on so many levels with that. But it's that immediate thought that fitness is a short-term thing. You do it because it's your wedding. You do it because you're going to go on holiday. And then, or you do it so then you can eat or drink or go on a night out. And ultimately, if you can do both of those and live very healthily, it doesn't have to be. Food doesn't have to be kind of a reward for that, or vice versa, and that's what we need to change. And I think it could be really exciting as to where we could go with that.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for your advice there. It's do what you love and build from there, basically.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, thanks ever so much for your time. Usually at the end of the podcast, what we do is we ask if you're reading any books that you would like to share with our audiences at all. Jennifer?
It's good to put me on the spot.
I do, I can see.
Yeah, well, actually, I was just listening to an audiobook on my way here because I had a bit of a 20-minute walk. to where we are recording this. And I've been listening to the new Jojo Meyer's book, The Giver of Stars. I think that's the name of it. I might have got that wrong, but it's absolutely wonderful. So I'm really engrossed with it right now. But one of my favorite books to recommend to people is there's a really lovely book that's just come out around digital minimalism. So for those who find themselves, quite addicted to social media and wanting to have a bit of a break from it, Cal Newport was the author, and he really makes a really convincing case about the benefits for your mental health in terms of taking a break from the digital world once in a while, and offers some really practical ways of doing it. So it's one that I often recommend.
Nice, digital detox. We all need it, I think.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And yourself, Tom?
Well, I'm not the strongest reader at all, and actually I probably haven't read a book since I was from cover to cover since I was about 17, so about 12 years. But it's funny you're asking that question now, because I've just finished a book that I read from cover to cover out here called This Is Going to Hurt, by a trainee nurse a trainee doctor who went through all the training, and filled us in on all sorts of his incredible stories, which gives you a huge respect for the NHS as a whole. But a bit more related to this is I'm not sure whether I can swear, so I'm not going to. But the title is "Everything Is Effed." A book about hope is the title. Everything is effed. A book about hope by Mark Manson, and I've only just finished it, but. I'm only about 50 pages in, and already I'm not sure I'm hooked. I'm intrigued. So
Nice.
It's definitely, I think, worth picking up.
Brilliant. Okay, cool. Wow, I'm sure I'll get into some of those as well, because I always enjoyed that little question at the end of our podcast, and my Amazon, Audible thing wish list just grows and grows and grows. Okay, so are there any social media links in case people want to follow you after this podcast on Twitter or LinkedIn or anything like that you'd like to share with us, Tom?
Well, you can get me on everything at Tom Bosworth or tombosworth.com.
Okay. And yourself, Jennifer?
Yep. So I'm at Dr. Jen Cumming, and website jennifercumming.com.
Okay. Brilliant. All right then. Well, thanks ever so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for listening. To keep up to date with Leading Communities podcast releases and updates, follow us at A4UCIC, at Ideal Directions, and at That's All Media.